We're going to start off this morning with a story about Eric Liddell. Let's get his picture up there. If you know who Eric Liddell is, I don't know, give me a nod or shout or raise your hand or flap your arms. All right. We're going to have two stories about Eric Liddell. One you probably know and the other one you might not know. The second one will come at the end. So here's who Eric Liddell was. He was this guy who grew up, actually he was Scottish, but he grew up, let's have a shout out from the Scottish contingent of our room. Yep, bagpipers. Eric Liddell was Scottish, but he grew up in China. He grew up as a child of missionaries in China in the early 1900s. And then, like many missionary children, he was sent to boarding school when he was, I guess, a teenager, back in Scotland. And in Scotland, so he'd been raised with this very clear faith in God, and he'd seen his parents serving God very sacrificially. As a teenager, he found out that he was really, really good at sports. Like, really good at sports. He became a rugby star by the time he was an older teen. And then he found out that he could run really fast, and so track and field is what he is known for. In fact, shortly we'll see he was in the Olympics in 1924. So he becomes known as the Flying Scotsman. And this picture that you have up here is a picture of how he ran. He had this really unique running style where at the end of a race, when he was pushing to the finish line, he would his head would go back like this, and he would almost close his eyes. People didn't know how he didn't trip or fall, or how did he know where he was going. I don't know. But for Eric, actually, it was an act of faith in God. He was putting his hope in God even as he ran. Now, Eric, in those days, the churches one of the ways that people worshiped God was a very, very strict sort of following of Sabbath or of a rest day on Sunday. And Eric Liddell, he wouldn't do any kind of work on Sundays. Now, we're not going to go into the details of is that quite right or wrong. We don't do that quite the same way today in the church. I will say that everybody needs to take a rest day. That's important for human life. We'll have a sermon about that another day sometime. But for Eric, he was very convinced, he was convicted that it would be wrong for him. This is what God was calling him to do, was always take this day of rest and worship and dedicate it just to God. Now, his race was the 100-meter. And he was, in 1923, 1924, he was the fastest 100-meter runner in the world. And he found out, leading up to the Olympics, that the 100-meter was going to be run on a Sunday. It was going to be run on a Sunday. And to most of his contemporaries, especially his fellow Scots, who really wanted to win their first Olympic medal ever, they had never won an Olympic medal, it was obvious that Eric should make an exception to his rule and just run the 100-meter in the 1924 Olympics in Paris. And to Eric, it was obvious that he should never do that. He should not run an Olympic race because Sunday was not a day for playing games. It was a day to set apart to God. And so he said, I will not run. And he got incredible backlash, all kinds of pressure from the Olympic Committee, from his countrymen, he got pressure even from the Crown Prince of the UK. He got a personal meeting that said, you got to do this for your country. Aren't you patriotic? And Eric simply said, it is not patriotic or right for me to go against conscience. I cannot do that. And so instead, he decided to run a race that he had not properly trained for. He decided, he did have some time to train for it, a few months. He decided to run the 400-meter, and everybody knew that he was going to lose because he was not a 400-meter runner. Long story short, you should go watch the movie Chariots of Fire if you've never seen it. Fantastic movie, a little bit older now, but really well done. And what happens is Eric Liddell wins this race, and he sets a world record in the 400-meter, which was not his event. And people all over the world looked and said, he honored God, and so God honored him. He stepped out in faith. Eric had a moment when there was all this pressure on him to do something that he in his heart knew would be against what God was asking him to do, and he would not do it. This was a moment when Eric had to jump. he had to take a big leap of faith. I'm going to trust it doesn't matter what the consequences are, but I'm going to trust that God's going to take care of me. I'm just going to step out in faith and do it anyway. That's the story of Eric Liddell. Amazing. We'll hear the second piece of his story closer to the end of the message. We're in a series of messages right now called Heroes of Faith. And we're looking at different people in the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews. We're looking at different people who are held up as great heroes, people who did amazing things by their faith in God, not because they were so great in themselves. And we've seen that again and again. In fact, most of these people were dysfunctional. They had dysfunctional families. But because deep down what they most wanted was a relationship with God, and they were willing to step out and jump at the right moment, to put their trust in God, God was able to use them, move them toward Him, help them grow, and eventually use them to do great things. Last week we left off in this list of heroes of faith with Joseph. And Joseph, so we're way back in the Old Testament here, and Joseph was down in Egypt. And his great act of faith at the end of his life was, even though the Israelites were in Egypt at that time, and they were there for, nobody could see a time when they weren't going to be in Egypt, they were there for the future. But Joseph trusted that even though it was going to take a long time, God was going to fulfill his promise. Joseph had seen God do that over and over again in his long life. And he knew that eventually God would fulfill that promise. But he also knew that the rest of the people would forget it. After years and generations went by, he knew that people would forget that God was going to fulfill his promise. They wouldn't trust. And so he ended his life saying, just believe him, he's going to do it. He's going to bring us out of Egypt someday. Don't forget. And as soon as he died, they immediately forgot. Because that's kind of what we do. So we fast forward here in the story, past Joseph. We're going to be looking at Moses today. And Moses, this is 400 years later that Moses enters the scene. And a lot had changed. And we could do tons of messages on Moses. Moses is the biggest figure apart from Jesus in the Bible. And he did so much by faith. But we're going to look at specifically his trust that God would use him, even though it didn't look right. It didn't look like God would use him at the beginning. So let's read here. Let's take a look in Hebrews chapter 11 and see what the writer of Hebrews says about Moses. He says actually quite a lot. So if you got a Bible, or you can look on the screen with me, we're going to be at Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verses 23 and then 24. This is the story of Moses. It begins with his parents. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw that he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Let's stop right there to begin with, and we'll give a little background here to what's going on. We'll talk about Moses' parents, what their act of faith was. Then we'll talk about Moses' act of faith in leaving Egypt, and we'll talk about what happened to him afterwards. So first of all, this is 400 years after the Israelites have first come to Egypt. The Israelites had come down, and Joseph was kind of the big kingpin, and so they had been really well received in Egypt. But way later, the Egyptians became very scared of them. And that was because God was blessing them, and they had a lot of kids. The Israelites were really productive. So in these 400 years, which is a long time, right? Think about how long 400 years ago is to us, right? So if we were the Israelites sitting at the time of Moses' birth, the time when they came down to Egypt was to them like the year 1619 is to us. That's a long time ago, right? Huge span of time has gone by. Do you guys feel like you have a good sense of what was going on in 1619? No, probably not. That's ancient history to us. So it was to them. They knew that God had spoken to their ancestors. There was some God. They didn't even know this God's name who had spoken to their ancestors, to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob and to Joseph. But this God it didn't seem like God had done anything in their lives or had any relationship with them for this whole time, this huge period of time afterwards. And there had been signs that God was blessing them. Like I said, they were very productive. So this group of people had gone from 75 people at the beginning of the 400 years when they went to Egypt. And now they were millions of people. Certainly more than 1 million people, maybe 2 million of them. There were tons of Israelites. And the Egyptians had become afraid of them because along the line in those 400 years, one of the Egyptian pharaohs had thought, and we'll talk about this in a minute, the pharaohs thought, well, I'm God. So that was the starting point in their reasoning, right? And you get to a lot of weird places if you start out with that as your beginning. So I'm God, and so it seems like a really good idea, therefore, to enslave these Israelites and make them do whatever I want. And then I can have lots of money and build really big stuff. The Egyptians built some big stuff. I'm sure you've heard of that. So they had become slaves. But as these slaves had constantly increased in number, the Egyptians got really scared. What if they rise up? There's so many of them. What if they rise up and rebel against us and try to take over our country? So they had implemented a system of persecution and control on the Israelites. And a big part of that system was that they weren't going to let them have very many children. In fact, it got so bad that at one point, the Pharaoh decided to kill every male child. So this was just standard procedure. When the Israelites had a baby, you had to show that baby to the Egyptians, and if it was a boy, the child had to die. And we don't know how long that was standard procedure, but a long time. So long, in fact, I think that this became just normal. Humans can get used to almost anything, even systematic genocide. We can just start to feel like it's normal after a while. And so all the parents in those days, because if you didn't present your child to the Egyptians, they would come and kill you, and maybe even more people in your community. And so this became the normal thing for the Israelites to simply bring their male children to the Egyptians, and that male child was just gone. So we see when Moses' parents, this is how the story begins. When Moses' parents have a child, and they decide that they're going to follow the way of God and just trust him. They're going to follow the way of God rather than doing what the Egyptians say. This is a leap of faith. They're risking their lives to do this. They see that the child is no ordinary child. That's what it says in Genesis. Does any parent think their child is ordinary? No. They see this child as a special child, just like every child is special. But they decide to step out in faith. And we're going to be talking about today, there are kind of two moments in faith. At one of the points of going through these different heroes of faith is to see exactly what is faith. Something we talk about a lot. And the story of Moses gives us this really clear illustration of how there are kind of two parts to faith. And the first part is a moment when you jump. You just jump. You know what God's asking you to do. It doesn't make sense. It seems like really bad things might happen to you, but you know it's the right thing to do, and so you do it anyway. And what we see here is the story begins when Moses' parents take a leap of faith. They take a leap of faith. And so they hide this child for a few months. And of course, they don't know how they're gonna keep this child. And eventually, they've hid the child from the Egyptians. But eventually, they can't hide the child anymore because this is Egyptian territory. They're being watched. There's stuff going on. And so eventually, they make a basket. They decide this is the best thing to do. They make a basket and they just put the child into the Nile River. Now, this, again, is an act of faith. They're sort of taking the child and saying, God, do something. Save this child in some way. Because what's probably going to happen, logically speaking, to a child that you put into a basket in the Nile River? Yeah, there's crocodiles in the Nile River. Okay? And so they send one of the daughters sits, or the sister of the child sits and watches what's going to happen. And amazingly, because God is, we talked about last time, sovereign. He's in control. He really is. Even though he allows human beings to make terrible decisions, he's in control over all of that. Eventually, the child is picked up by Pharaoh's daughter and raised in the royal household in Egypt. This is astonishing. But as Moses grows up, let's read the next section and see what happens to him. He realizes as he grows up that he is not an Egyptian. He is actually a Hebrew, one of the Israelites. And as he grows, we don't have a lot of details about how this happens, but Moses begins to realize that God, a God he doesn't even really know, is calling him to do something, has arranged his life for a purpose. And Moses faces a time when he has to take his leap of faith, his jump. The amazing thing is that he does it. The next section in Hebrews chapter 11, starting at verse 24, says this: By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. That means they go away real fast. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, or abandoned Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. Now, you imagine Moses growing up. He's in the royal family. I mean, what's the equivalent today? He's growing up. His parents are CEOs of some major multinational corporation. He is massively rich in Pharaoh's household. Egypt is, at this time, one of the two great centers of civilization, and it's the more powerful. This is the center of power in the world. And he is right at the center of it. They control everything. We talked about last week how the Nile River, this was the core of Egyptian wealth, because in the region, everybody else depended on rainfall for their crops to grow. But the Egyptians didn't, because they had the Nile River, and every single year at the same time, the Nile River would flood. It was the most consistent flooding river in the ancient world. And so they dug canals in order to irrigate their fields. And so when everybody else was starving, Egypt had grain, they had food. And then whenever a drought came and all the other nations around them were starving, they would say, sure, give us all your money and we'll give you a little bit of food. And they became very, very wealthy in this way. This is the pattern throughout the whole ancient period. So he's living in the richest place possible. Imagine you had grown up like that. You grew up with the richest of the rich. You have power. You have authority. Everybody looks up to you. But as he grows, he begins to realize that he's been set apart for a purpose. Again, we don't know how that came into his life, how that knowledge came. He maybe knew something he'd heard of this God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but he knew nothing about this God, really. He didn't even know this God's name. All the other people around him, the Egyptians, are worshiping all these different gods. And in fact, the Pharaoh, like I said, claimed to be a god. They're worshiping Pharaoh himself. Yet Moses hears this call from this other God to go and help people who are in terrible need, his own people, the Israelites. And when he hears this, he makes a decision. In Hebrews, it's described as he considers it worthless. He considers all the treasures of Egypt worthless compared to the call of Christ. He chose to be mistreated with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. So it goes like this in some way in Moses' mind as he gets older. And it takes him a long time to get to this point. He's 40 years old before he makes a move on what God has obviously prepared him to do and arranged his life for this mission. He believes that God is calling him to help the Israelites, his people, get out of slavery somehow. But he's 40 years old before he makes that move because of all this pressure that's on him. Just like Eric Liddell must have felt all this pressure from these important people who were around him, from his own countrymen, just like he must have felt all this pressure because he would be famous if he ran this race and he would have lots of money, so Moses felt all this pressure to stay in the role that he was in and have his own life just be great. But he decides to abandon Egypt. His reasoning goes something like this. I see that all the people around me are wealthy and powerful and they have everything they want, but they're doing what's wrong. And somehow, I don't know how, but somehow I think that if I do the right thing, this God that I don't even know is going to take care of me. And in the end, things will turn out better for me. If these Egyptian gods that they're worshiping cause the Egyptians to do all these awful things, then I don't want anything to do with these gods. If these gods lead Pharaoh and all his armies to oppress people, to kill people, to murder babies, then I'm not going to have anything to do with that. I think there must be some other God out there who's actually good. I don't know anything about him, but I'm going to trust that somehow he's going to take care of me. And so Moses does, and he takes his leap of faith. This is his moment when he has to jump in faith. The first point in your bulletin you can write down is this: be willing to risk your safety, wealth, and reputation to follow the call of Christ. This is what Moses does. He considers all of that stuff, the greatest things that the world has to offer, and he says, compared with what I could have, and he only barely knows about it, with the true God, all of that stuff is nothing when compared with what I could have with God. A relationship with the real God, a life that's actually lived in truth instead of a life that's based on a lie. And he jumps. He jumps and he does this. He goes and he starts hanging out with the Israelites, which he must have had a lot of pressure not to do something like that. The prince of Egypt hanging out with a bunch of slaves. And then he begins to try and do things to help them. He goes a little bit overboard, right? You guys, probably most of you know the story. He sees an Egyptian beating one of the Hebrews, and he gets so mad. And now Moses, he's been raised to be a ruler, to be a king, right? And so this is probably normal operating procedure for him, right? When he sees something that he doesn't like, and he wants to deal with it, he just goes and beats this guy. And he actually beats him until he dies. I don't know if Moses meant to murder this Egyptian, but he does. So he has now stepped out in a great leap of faith to try and help the people of Israel. And so immediately the people of Israel are all with him, and he's able to lead them out of Egypt the next day. No. What happens is the people of Israel go, we aren't following you. We don't even know who you are. They turn him in. They tell Pharaoh and the guards, because they're scared of all the Egyptians, they tell Pharaoh what's going on. At least I think that's what happens. Pharaoh finds out really quickly. And then Moses, when he realizes that it's become known in the royal household that he killed an Egyptian to try and save one of the Israelite slaves, he gets on Pharaoh's hit list. And he has to run for his life from Egypt. And so the very next scene that we have, Moses is in the middle of the desert, in this foreign country that he has nothing to do with. He's never been before. He doesn't know anything. He's in the middle of the desert, and he's super depressed. And you can imagine what he's thinking at this point. I stepped out in faith. I took this giant leap trusting that God would save me, and God didn't show up. Everything went awful. As soon as I did this, my life is now 5,000 times, that's my approximate calculation, 5,000 times harder than it was before. Everything, I've followed God, I've jumped out in faith, and now everything is awful. You can see that Moses thinks this. When he gets into this new land, shortly he meets someone and he gets married, and the first child that he has, he names the child Foreigner. And he says, as he names the child, he says, I have become a foreigner, a wanderer in a foreign, barren land. It's like you named your kid, My Life Sucks, right? I mean, so Moses is super depressed. But as he's there, and listen, this takes a long time for Moses, right? If you are a person who feels like, man, I've been trying to follow God in my life, and I've been trying to grow the right way, and it seems like it's taken a long time. Man, I've been following God for a year, and it seems like I'm just not getting where I want to be. I've been following God for 10 years, and it seems like I'm still struggling with some of the same things. Moses was 40 before he even tried to follow God, and then to turn him into the man he needed to be, which is what's going to happen next, it took God 40 years in the wilderness. Moses was a really slow learner, okay? You can actually go faster than this with the power of Jesus. Thanks be to God. He was 80 before he was ready, in God's view, to do what he was made to do. 80. Wow, okay, that's crazy. So what happens in the wilderness is that Moses doesn't recognize it at first, but God is still with him. We don't know a lot of the details of what happens while he's in the wilderness, but it's clear to me that God keeps showing up in his life. How do I know this? The first son that he has in the wilderness, he names, "My life sucks. I'm a foreigner in a foreign land." The second son that he has, he names, "God is my helper." You see what's happening to Moses in the wilderness? He begins to see God showing up in different small ways in his life. It takes him this time to realize that God has called him to do what he thought in the beginning. God has called him to go and save the Israelites from Egypt, but it's not about him. And he's going to have to be reliant on God, not on his own power, his own abilities, his own strength. Later on, the Bible will describe Moses like this. It will say Moses was the most humble human being on the face of the earth. That's how Moses is later described. And that is essential. In order to do what he's been called to do, he had to be the most humble human being on the face of the earth. Otherwise, all the stuff that God's going to do to him would have gone straight to his head and he would have turned away from God. God knew that he couldn't handle it until he had been shaped. Remember last week, one of the points that we took away from Moses was this: I need to allow God to use my pain to shape me into the person I was made to be. I need to allow God to use my pain to shape me. Instead of thinking that God has abandoned me because there are hard things in my life. No, no, no. That was allowed into your life, not given by God, but allowed so that you could be made into the person that you were created to be and used by God in powerful ways. But you have to keep on trusting. And so here's the second part of faith. We said the first part of faith that we see in the story of Moses is you got to jump. There are these moments in our life with God when we know what God is asking us to do. We know the right thing to do. Everything in the world is telling us, no, no, no. There's all this pressure, and we just got to jump. That's the first part of faith. The second part of faith is this: a long waiting. The second part of faith is that things don't go the way we thought they would in the beginning, and we've got to keep on trusting God over the long haul. If you've been trying to follow God for more than a few months, you've seen this over and over again in your life. Just think about the events that have happened in your life. I don't even need to convince you or give you examples. Just think about your own life and you will realize that's what's happened. There are times when you had to step out, and hopefully you did, and especially if you did, often things got worse in some ways as a result. God's still showing up. But there's a long period where you had to wait because God is shaping you during that period. God is shaping you. But Moses, we find out how he gets through that period, and it's the exact same way that Joseph did, which we looked at last week. We heard the writer of Hebrews describe it, and he describes it so well. Let me read that one verse for you again. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 27. How did Moses keep on following God in the wilderness? How did he grow in his relationship when he was suffering from depression and thought his life had completely failed? How did he keep going? By faith. Moses abandoned Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. And he persevered because he saw him who is invisible. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. He didn't spend all of his time, at least after that first day when he named his son, he didn't spend all of his time focused on all the things that are wrong with my life and how unfair it is that God's allowed these things into my life, and I'm angry at God because of it. He spent his time focused on, I know there is a God. I want to know him more. I got to find a way to follow after him. I got to find a way to get to him. I got to find a way to see him. He focused on those things. And through that, God was able to grow him. And then he was able to use him because once Moses had learned and developed you see he's growing into a relationship with God here. In the beginning, he's heard what God has asked him to do, but he doesn't actually know God. By the time he's gone through these 40 years, then finally there's this amazing scene at the burning bush, if you've heard about that, where God speaks to him in a really clear way, although I think God clearly had spoken to him many times before this. When Moses hears God's call at the burning bush, he's not surprised by it. He immediately says, "Here I am." But one of the things that he wants to know is, who exactly are you? I want to know you more. We see this later in his life as well. Moses' greatest desire becomes, I want to know you, God. The writer of Hebrews says he was looking forward to his reward. What is his reward? He was looking forward to something greater than all the treasures of Egypt. What is greater than all the treasures of Egypt? Is he looking forward to having an awesome time in heaven? He didn't even know about heaven, actually. Moses was looking forward to a relationship with the real God, to knowing the God who made him. That's what pulled him through. So many times in the Bible, we see this over and over again. People who are trying to follow God, but they're at the end. It's been so difficult. What pulls them through? There's nowhere else to go. Everything is really hard as I'm trying to follow God, but actually, this is the only chance I have to ever reach any kind of fulfillment in my life, to ever fill this void that's inside of me. The only chance is to actually know the real God. That's what pulls Moses through. And as he gets to know this God at the burning bush, God reveals himself in a deeper way to Moses. And this repeats in his life, God revealing himself in deeper and deeper ways. Their relationship gets deep. And the deeper their relationship is, the more Moses is able to walk through fire. The more he's able to go through things that you're just like, how could he do that? How could this guy be bold enough to walk into the most powerful nation on earth, walk into Pharaoh's courtroom and say, I'm taking your slaves out of the country, and you better listen, because otherwise bad stuff's going to happen to you. How did he get that brave? Because he knows God is right there with him. He's not doing it on his own anymore. So, your second point for the bulletin is this: you can get through discouragement and doubt by looking to him who is invisible. This is one of the great secrets of life. Only it's not a secret. The Bible's been screaming it out to us for thousands of years. You can get through the discouragement and the doubt of this life by looking to God, to the one who is invisible. Moses is able to go through amazing things as a result of God's work in his life as he continues, both being willing to jump, take a leap of faith, and being willing to wait in obedience to God, to accept that God has made him wait a long time and go through a lot of trials and difficulties to reach the place he was made to go. Let's hear the second half of Eric Liddell's story, because it's kind of amazing. Eric Liddell, after he won the 1924 Olympics, he went on and got a whole bunch of sponsorships and then got a mansion in Beverly Hills. No, actually, after he won the 1924 Olympics in Paris, and the whole nation of Great Britain thought he was the greatest thing in the world, he spent a couple of years more running races, and then he said to himself, you know what? All of this fame and all of this wealth, all of this stuff that's been given to me, that is nothing compared to the things that I grew up with. All of that is nothing compared to what I saw with my parents growing up when they would submit their lives to God and help people who were really in need in China. And so he went back to China as a missionary. He got married, had some kids, spent his time doing exactly what his parents had done, helping people who were in extreme poverty and who didn't know God come closer to him in China. And then World War II came onto the horizon. And all the missionaries started leaving China because they could see that the Japanese might come in and take over, and that was going to be really bad for them. And Eric Liddell stayed. He stayed put, knowing that the Japanese were going to come in and take over because he said, you know what? I can't abandon the people that I've been called to in their greatest moment of need, and my life really isn't that important. This picture that you have up here, two pictures. One, the first one with Eric in his coat and his hat, is Eric actually in the middle of sneaking across Japanese lines to bring aid and support and Bibles to groups of Chinese that he had been serving. And the second one is the concentration camp in which Eric Liddell died. And that's the part of the story that's not told in Chariots of Fire. And the amazing part, he knew what was coming. And he considered the call of Christ of so much greater value than all the wealth and all the fame and even than his own life. And so he stayed put. And in that concentration camp, he said, you know what, I'm here in this concentration camp controlled by the Japanese forces. There's about 2,000 people in the camp. And he spent all of his time in that camp trying to encourage people and show them how they could get through discouragement and doubt by looking to God. That's what he spent his time doing. He wasn't killed by the Japanese. He eventually developed a brain tumor that nobody knew he had because he was in a concentration camp. And one day, his very last words, this teenage girl came to visit him. He was constantly teaching and trying to help people grow closer to God. Let's bring up that quote. I think I have it on there. And these are a paraphrase from the teenage girl later reported of Eric Liddell's last words. As he is about to die in this concentration camp, he says this: we need to surrender our will to God in everything we do. In our attitudes, it is not what we want to do and feel like doing, but what God wants us to do. Surrender. And as he said the word surrender to this teenage girl, his head went back, he had a stroke, slipped into a coma, and died. The last word out of his mouth was surrender. One of the things we like to say here at Community of Hope, and this is the last point for your bulletin, is this: surrender is victory. What does that mean? Surrender is when an army gives up. It's not talking about surrender to some evil thing, but surrender. All of us in our lives have been fighting against God. We've been fighting against what God wants for us. Even after we first jump and start to follow after him, we still many times continue to fight against him. He brings new things. This is what I want you to do, and it's not what we want. We want to do this other thing, and so we fight against him. Victory is when you give up that fight. When you give up that fight against God, you surrender. You take that leap of faith, or you stay put, even though you're going to have to wait a long time, and you allow the pain, you allow God to use it to shape you into the person you were made to be. That's when your life becomes a life of victory. And God is able to use you to do what you were created to do. Let's pray.